Right, so there's something I see people doing, especially in these events. Not often, but sometimes. Which, because of the context of this, I'm going to call "Missing the Forest for the Princess," and I've actually mostly seen people do this in Kashtira. Um, but I'll just let it go. Let my opponent make their board here. They're going to be playing Horus, so they're going to get a bunch of Horus monsters in grave, summon Ecclesia, turn that into Iris Sword Soul. So that's good, right? We've got Iris Sword Soul on board, 3 Horus monsters. That's an end board. You could pass. No. My opponent turns that into IP Masquerena. With the Masquerena and the only Horus monster remaining, turns those into Promethean. There's no fire monster in grave. The monster that's being sent is this Blackwing Tuner. So there's no fire monster in grave, so we have to turn the Iris Sword Soul into Amblowell. Now, I want to talk about what my opponent's end board is, and what I mean by missing the forest for the princess. So like I mentioned, my opponent had a board that was okay. And I'm going to argue that if you've, let's say, just complete void state, not mentioning any specific cards, let's say if you've got 2 mediocre interactions and you can turn them into 1 strong interaction, I'm going to argue that you don't always do it. Because it's more for your opponent to work through, especially if it means more large bodies on the board. In this case, yes, I drew the Book of Eclipse that I'm playing for Kashtira, but I see a lot of people do this with Horus, where they're throwing away all of the Horus monsters, which get effects if your opponent starts clearing the other ones, and they're protected by the sarcophagus, to make these big boss monsters that are not as interactive. Just like people do in Kashtira, they'll throw away everything to make the Kashtira Xyz monsters when they really shouldn't have done it. Just leave the Fenrir and the Unicorn on board and pass sometimes. But my opponent's board here, this is doing nothing because there aren't any Horus monsters on the board. This is doing nothing, there aren't any Horus monsters on the board. So those 2 are blanks. Swarm Ship. This doesn't do anything on its own. This is Blue Eyes White Dragon. Yes, it's got a float effect, but that's predicated on your dedication to the princess. So yeah, she's in here. That's great. That's an interaction. But it's also Magical Dimension. It's Magical Dimension. But very telegraphed. So that's not great. Also, Promethean is a good card. She's extremely strong of a card. But part of that goes in context. Now I'll talk about that context once I've gone over the rest of the opponent's grave here. This card, Iris Sword Soul, as I mentioned, this was good when it was on the field. It prevents a big part of my strategy. The Horus monsters, when they're on the field, they're good. They've all got these effects where if another card leaves your field, something happens. There's no Blackwing Synchro on the board. This is doing nothing. That could have been the normal summon, potentially. Master Duel won't tell me what's in the extra. This Masquerena was used to make the Promethean for some reason, so it's not doing anything, and the Promethean firelocks you. When you're playing Snake Eye, you do this because you can put the Masquerena in your back row with Flamberge, summon it with the field spell during your opponent's turn. Field spell or Flamberge. And use that before you're using your Promethean interaction. This is doing nothing here. And as I mentioned, the Ecclesia, that was our whole normal summon. For what? Deck Thin 1? Use it as a single link material? That's nothing. Much better would have been summoning Stratos and adding a hero, even if it's like Clayman from the deck. It would have been better than this. So yeah, my opponent's entire end board is Blue Eyes White Dragon and Magical Dimension. And it's all telegraphed. It's so easy to play through. So here I'm just going to take the princess, summon the recycler, which arguably could be considered a misplay, because I've got the Snake Eyes here to bait the princess, but it's not a misplay if I don't believe my opponent's... If I believe that my opponent's not going to take that bait. So as soon as I get the Poplar, as you can see there, I just moved the Swarm Ship back. My opponent literally has no interactions left. This wouldn't have happened if they just didn't make Promethean Princess. And this is what I mean by don't miss the forest for the princess, right? Like, I understand, you want to get to the princess, and that's good. She's a good card. But you have to live through the forest. You got to survive the forest to get there, to keep up this weird metaphor. So I'm going to pause my field here in just a second. Once I get this res. Alright, so this board right here, we're going to talk about throwing away your entire board for a boss monster. Because from this board I can do that. If I were stopped here by something, right? If there was some reason that I had to stop here, I could get one more link summoned, that's all. I would just turn the Golem and the Ash into IP Masquerena, pass. Let's assume I don't have Book of Eclipse. I'm throwing away my entire board with this Masquerena to make Underworld Goddess. What do I get out of it? So first of all, the link material from Underworld Goddess, getting that off my opponent's board. The lib is returning a card from the board, so that's -2 for my opponent. Underworld Goddess is negating all the face-up monsters on the board. She is potentially negating something that would move the graveyard. I'm using Flamberge as part of the material. Potentially Flamberge is having moved something from my opponent's back row onto my board at this point. But Flamberge is summoning Oak and Poplar from grave. Poplar is getting me extension for next turn. The Oak's bringing back the Ash, so I've still got them on board. This is, if you're throwing away your entire board for a boss monster, you should be getting that much out of it. So I just kind of wanted to talk about, consider what your deck can do without the card that you're considering to be like the end game, right? What does your deck look like without the end game? Is there an alternate end game? Because there should be. There just should be. Sometimes an end board like this, I can have an end board, get stuff cleared, end on just a scrap monster. Hopefully it's Golem, right? And then be like, I'll set Book of Eclipse. That Golem will survive till my next turn. I get around to it. It does. Let's talk about a board in particular, right? Let's say I've got Golem, I've got Recycler, and I've got a Jet Synchron on board. I could turn all of those into Virtual World Shen Shen, because I am playing Shen Shen. And that's a floodgate, right? But it's that one boss monster on its own. Or I could have the Golem and turn the Recycler and the Jet Synchron into SP Little Knight, leave that on my board, pass. The SP banishes herself and the Golem so that I have Golem on my next turn, so the Golem can turn into the second Wyvern, and then I can pop my opponent's board and pop off myself. Right, just an example in this deck. But I see people do things, just make Promethean like this opponent did, end board Appaloosa, end board just a Boral Savage, and but like, it happens with these cards that are considered very strong, that people do this, the classic Firewall Pass. But if we look at it in a little bit of a different context, like we all know, you don't just end on a Galaxy Photon Lord. I don't even play Galaxies, but if you just ended on a Galaxy Photon Lord, that's obviously terrible. You got to end with Galaxy Photon Lord and the other guys, because it has to go in that context to be your end board. Just to give that example there, right? Back in Dino Rabbit format, weren't just ending on boards of Dolka Pass, it was Dolka Set 4 Pass. The cards are good in a context where you have other cards around them. You can't just end on Blue Eyes Pass and think that that's okay, that's going to be like a fine end game. Like, you're playing a good deck here, opponent. And this is why I hid their name. I'm not trying to like shame this opponent or anything. It happens. I've done it. I've done this kind of thing, for sure. But usually, if you're ending on a board like that, it's because you've done it through interruption, and at that point you can go, Yeah, Swarm Ship does float. It's a Blue Eyes, but it floats. I've got Promethean and Graves. That's an interruption. You know, if the opponent's top decking, they're working off of stuff, that's okay, right? Like, that's good enough. If I had 2 cards in hand to start the turn, you know, that might have been something. But that wasn't the case. It's not how that went. So here we are. Here we are. Yeah, so I'm gonna let you get that finished screen. Just, you know, remember, don't miss the forest for the princess. You gotta survive to get there. And that's not doing it.